Okay, and welcome everyone. You've been listening to myself, Tim Grant, chat with Lisa Howard, one of the two presenters this evening. And I say this evening because it's late afternoon on the West Coast where Lisa Howard is, but it's now just getting dark here in Toronto where I'm sitting. But from wherever you're from, a warm welcome to you. And you're in for a real treat, as I mentioned to a couple of you a few minutes ago. I did a practice session with Lisa, and it's not just a visually rich, but a very stimulating presentation that she has for us this evening. And before I introduce her and our second presenter, I want to give you a sense, especially to those of you who are new, of where we're going for the next 60 minutes. Lisa and will do her presentation, and Anders, we have a tape of his presentation that I'll explain why in a minute. And when they're together, their presentation will last approximately 30 minutes, and then it'll be time for you to ask questions of, in this case, Lisa alone. And the place to do that is in the chat box, and some of you have already put a comment in the chat box in answer to a question I asked a little bit earlier, which I appreciate. If by chance you have just joined us and you're not sure where the chat box is, bring your cursor down to the bottom of the screen. That'll expose a black toolbar. One of the topics is chat, and if you click that, it'll open up a box that you can drag off to the side, and you won't be able to see the comments that have been there or placed there already, but all new comments will be visible to you. And at the 60-minute mark, I'm going to ask your indulgence, and you'll see this on one of Lisa's last slides, to fill out an end of webinar survey. It takes about 60 to 90 seconds, telling us what you liked and disliked, and whether the sound quality was okay, that kind of thing. And those of you who do indulge me in that request will be able to win one of two free subscriptions to Green Teacher. I'm also, by the way, we have a fairly, although the topic is a really important one, we didn't have enough time really to promote this webinar. And so we have a really nice, cozy group of people here on this webinar. And when we get to the questions, I'm even wondering if you can let me know in the chat box if you want me to give you an opportunity to ask your question verbally and directly rather than typing it into the chat box. I've never tried that before, but with a small group, we certainly could. Just before, again, I introduce Lisa and Anders, let me say a little bit about Green Teacher, the host of this webinar. I've been the editor of it for more than 25 years now, and it's a magazine, Lisa, if you can advance the slide, where educators share their best, Not letting me. That's okay, thank you, perfect. Share their best ideas for educating kids about on a wide variety of environmental topics. And in the last 10 years, we've also had the pleasure of publishing a number of books. And our most recent two actually are in the upper left-hand corner, teaching about invasive species and teaching teens about climate change. And next week, we're releasing a book called Teaching Kids About Climate Change, which we're for younger students, which we're very excited about. And I mentioned both the magazine and books simply to say that if by chance you're not yet a subscriber or you haven't purchased any of our nonprofit books, I'd strongly encourage you to do so, because that's going to, among other things, give us the resources and to continue to offer these webinars for free. Okay, without further ado, and by the way, you've heard that this webinar is being taped, so you don't really need to take notes. We will send out an email tomorrow to you and everyone else who registered with the details of how to access the archive version, so you can share it with your friends if you like the presentation, as I assume you will. And Lisa, if you could just go back to those last two slides, which we have here a list of all of our US partners who have been promoting this webinar. Some of you might have heard about it through one of these organizations. And on the next slide are Canadian partners. And if you're in a state or province that you recognize one of these logos is from, please check out their websites if you're not necessarily familiar with them, and support these organizations, because we've really appreciated their support of this webinar. Okay, now without further ado, let me introduce Lisa Howard, whose voice you've already heard briefly in the background as we were doing our technical setup. She's a landscape architect with a design firm in the Bay Area called Bay Tree Design, located in Berkeley, California. She's a leadership council member of a kind of a relatively recent organization across the globe called the International School Grounds Alliance. And she's the co-chair of the Alliance's Risk Group. Quite appropriate to have her here speaking on this to us on this topic. But for over 20 years, she's been providing expertise in design of public, institutional, community, and generally sustainable landscapes. She, not surprisingly, has a master's degree in landscape architecture from UC Berkeley, and she's traveled over 200 children's landscapes, whether parks, school grounds, adventure playgrounds, etc., in 8 countries to learn of best practices, successes, and failures. And I've heard Lisa's name for many, many years, though we've not yet had a chance to meet. And the other person whose picture you saw, and you'll only be hearing from him in a taped interview, is Anders Wangi Schjelsen. And Anders is the director of Nature Skolan, and I'm not probably pronouncing it very well. It translates in English to the Nature School, and that's located in Lund, as is he, in Lund, Sweden. And because of the time difference, Anders was actually game to join this webinar in the live session until he realized he had a whole schedule of meetings tomorrow, and you know, joining us between 2:30 in the morning and 4 in the morning just was not going to make the next few days very productive for him. So we're going to be hearing from him via a wonderful 10-minute videotape that he has sent us, and we'll share that with you shortly. But back to my telling you a little bit about him. He's also a Leadership Council member of the International School Grounds Alliance, and with Lisa, he co-chairs the Alliance's Risk Group. He's also a specialist teacher in natural science, and in line with the objectives laid out in Sweden's national curriculum, he plans and carries out education courses in natural science and education for sustainable development. And these are programs that he conducts primarily for the Lund District Council's employees. So please, would you join me in a warm welcome to both Lisa and Anders? And Lisa, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. Wow, that was a great introduction. And I tend to sometimes talk quickly or softly. So if at any point you can't really hear me, just put your hand up in the chat box and let me know, and I'll slow down. So what I'm going to cover today is a little bit about the International School Grounds Alliance. I'm going to go over some key terminology that I like for people to understand when they're talking about what is risk and beneficial risk in school grounds. And then what I'm going to go into is a little bit about the process that we went through to develop our risk declaration, and what were those sort of global understandings that we came to through that process. And then I'll turn it over to Anders' video. But before I get started, I wanted to just ask you guys in the chat box if you could put down where you're from, and I need to talk louder, I see already. If you could put down where you're from and what, if any, experience that you've had in negotiating risk in outdoor play and learning. I'm going to turn my volume all the way up, so I'll do my best to talk louder.
No, you're doing fine, Lisa. That's great.
Okay. So just quickly, Tim introduced the International School Grounds Alliance, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly, but we're a global organization, or a global network of organizations and professionals. There's currently about 60 members from 20 different countries around the globe. And one of the key things that brought us together initially was this idea of risk and that being lost to children as they develop. But before I tell you more about us and how you can get involved if you would like to, I'm going to walk you through the shared understanding that we've developed. You can see on the screen are some images of our conference that we held in Toronto in 2013 and some of our key goals on the left. So it's possible that some of you might remember Mariana Bersani's presentation on Green Teacher. I believe it was in 2015 that she gave it. The basis of our ISGA risk declaration and many of our discussions focused on many of the same points that are in her presentation. We didn't really know that that was on, and we just happened to be discussing the same things at the same time. But if you haven't seen it, I recommend you go back and watch it. And one of the key pieces and sort of the basis of all of this is the understanding of play. And really, play is the work of children, and we often forget what play is, but that's just a great starting point to think about when we're thinking about risk and play. Oh, before I go on, you can see that the pictures have names on them and locations. All of the images in this presentation are from different ISGA Leadership Council members from around the world, demonstrating either school grounds that they work on as supervisors or as designers or in other capacities. So it's just demonstrating a little bit about what happens globally and what we're talking about here. So another point is that we kept going back to in our discussions was Ellen Sandister's discussion, our research called Categorizing Risky Play. And she really broke it down into 6 types of play. And this was really framed our discussions a lot and going back to what are global examples. But so what we have here is the first one is play with great heights. And so we've got an image here up on the right, on the top, and this is from the kids on the schoolyard in Taiwan building a treehouse fort up in trees, which is completely allowed, not a big deal there. Playing with high speed, so running and jumping, and then playing with harmful tools. So there's an image of a kid here working with a knife, whittling. Playing near dangerous elements, which we've seen, and I didn't have room for pictures for everything here, but with fire and water, and you'll see some of that more throughout the presentation. Rough and tumble play. And then the idea of playing where children can disappear and get lost. And the picture down on the bottom left, right, you can see kids kind of disappearing into the bushes. This is at a school ground in Berlin. And this is one of the things that really sparked me before I even knew ISGA. I went on this tour, and everywhere I've seen kids disappearing. And I'm from California, where every teacher has to see every child at every moment. And I asked the guy giving the tour, so how does this work? How do you supervise? Because I was thinking, how do I come back and tell teachers in California? And he looked so confused by my answer. And then finally he said, oh, the teacher sits here and the children know where to find the teacher if they get hurt. So it's a very different methodology of supervision there. But allowing children to disappear and get lost is really important for their development. Something that's really key in understanding risk is kind of going backwards and thinking about what is the children's realm. And I know this image comes up a lot in different presentations, but it just really captures a lot of what we had and what was lost. And so if you haven't seen this image before, it's an aerial of a town in the UK, and it's showing 4 generations of what the child at age 8 could roam within one family. The great-grandfather, the really big image, could walk 6 miles to go fishing. The grandfather at age 8 in 1950 was able to walk into the woods. So both of them are accessing nature and marginal landscapes and unmanaged adult landscapes on their own on a daily basis, which just has so many affordances within them. The mother in 1979 was able to walk to the swimming pool, and the kid, when this came out a few years ago, was able to walk 300 yards down the street. So the range has really changed. And in my professional work and as a parent, I ask, what have children lost with the right to roam daily? And how can we provide opportunities that this great-grandfather had to our children today? Particularly in school grounds, which we know are a daily landscape that children have access to. The answers that I've come up with are that, we need to provide them with beneficial risk-free play or unstructured time, access to really go into their wonder and curiosity. And this has all happened in the marginal landscapes, the vacant lots, the wildlands that didn't have codes and policies. And if there's other thoughts that you have on that, I would love to see them come up in the chat box. So this is a point that Mariana made that I completely agree with, and that is that going from that sort of outdoor realm where children can roam in the wild to sort of the managed spaces, this is what a lot of managed spaces look like, unfortunately, in California. They're shaped by codes, maintenance budgets, and adult safety assumptions, and safety in quotes, that create this kit, fence, carpet, KFC, no nutritional value. as ISGA members, we are hoping that we can empower children in a safe environment and that we can give them opportunities to grow, but we want to move away from this KFC approach. So before I go further, those are some of the ideas that came up on the Mariana Bersani thing that we were talking about among ourselves globally. I want to kind of go into some terms that help with understanding of discussion. So Peter Kells from Grace Kells in Ontario is somebody I've been working with since I met him at the ISGA conference in Toronto. And a while back, he told me, you know what, if you start with some terms, it really makes for great discussions. And he shared his terms with me, and I've built upon those terms. So as you go through these, you're going to see, like at the top here, source of harm. It gives the original source and then who I actually got it from, and then some I have added to. So on this first page here, I've got hazards. And really, the essence of a hazard is very different than risk, and I want to really clarify that. A hazard is something that a child cannot see, they cannot perceive. A child shouldn't need to assess a hazard or worry about hazards. It's our job to identify hazards as adult professionals and mitigate those hazards. And the examples I have here are really examples of hazards in play equipment per se. But I want to get to the point that play isn't all on play equipment, but when we're looking at hazards, a lot of it is. So the examples here on the top right, that's an S-hook on a swing set. And the codes within the US that we go to, ASTM and CPSC, require that we have closed S-loops so that the swing hooks don't come off as the child is swinging. On the next picture down is the bolts, and they're done incorrectly, so that becomes an entanglement hazard or what's called a protrusion. And then on the bottom right is a picture of a post and the guardrail on a deck of a play structure. And the yellow thing is what's called a neck entrapment. And so it's this test you do as a certified playground safety inspector. Can a child get their neck in there and get stuck? So really what we want to do with hazards is, as in playgrounds, we're looking to identify them as certified playground safety inspectors, as park managers, playground equipment designers, and other professionals. And children shouldn't be needing to worry about these. These should be taken care of by us. So then we go into risk. Oh, and sorry, back on the hazard, it's just sort of the standard of care as professionals. So in terms of risk, it's very different than hazard, as I was saying. And Robin Moore, who's an ISGA member, states that risk is in every situation in life. Growing up is learning to navigate risk. Business deals are full of risk. There's risk throughout our lives. And what we need to consider is the probability of the occurrence of that risk and the severity of that harm. So in this image, we've got some kids that are trying to climb this enormous bay tree. And there is that high branch. And so what are the chances of one of those kids getting up to that very high branch? And that would be, and then what are the chances of, if they get up there, the probability or occurrence of them falling off? So my guess is if they can get all the way up there, they're pretty good climbers, so they most likely won't fall off. So the occurrence is probably fairly low. But if they do fall off, the severity of the harm will be pretty severe, probably a broken arm or something along those lines. Whereas there's this boy down on the log, what are the chances of that boy or another child trying to balance on that log and falling off? Probably much more than climbing the tree. And what are the possibilities of the injury? They're going to be a lot less severe than falling off a high branch. So looking at occurrence and severity of harm is really how to define risk. So this is a risk equation by Bernard Spiegel from PlayLink in the UK, and he showed this at the ISGA conference in 2011. And he really sparked our discussions at the ISGA on risk, and really drove us into talking about risk. And I just love this because it really clearly illustrates the fact that life is full of risk. Anytime you do something new, there's this risky moment with the experience yet to be had. So it's the experience of wonder, of curiosity. The first time you take a step, the first time you climb a small tree, the first time you pick up a hammer, the first time you do anything has risk, and that's something to think about. So as Bernard shows that risk is necessary to challenge oneself, getting into the idea of challenge, part of our discussions were really fascinating because you come in with the assumptions of your culture. And in our discussions, we found out that in Brazil and in Chile, that risk isn't even an issue. They don't even think about it. So here's an image of a playground in Chile, and they don't worry about risk. They just provide for challenge. But on the other hand, we had the Germans who completely embrace risk in a way that goes beyond what the Chileans and Brazilians were doing. They're saying, yes, we want risk. They actually have a policy that says you learn to fall by falling. And they've stated that a playground is a place to encounter risk and overcome fear, and that playing without risk is a risk. So with challenge, they say, comes resilience, building up confidence, and many life skills. So there's challenge, and then there's graduated level of challenge. And that's really key to understanding and getting comfortable with it. It's like going from the shallow end of a swimming pool to the deep end, starting off with small challenges and kind of building up. The Germans say you challenge by challenging and letting children play to their own capabilities. So they design their school grounds with these places that encourage free movement, sports, balance, climbing, and jumping, and often in really social ways, so that play is having lots of different developmental experiences happening at once. So this is an image in a Berlin schoolyard. And this is the highest level of challenge in terms of jumping that I saw in the schoolyard. But these are the older kids also in the schoolyard. So there was other places where there were lower rocks and lower walls and lower logs that you could balance on and jump off of. But this group of kids was just doing their thing, and we happened to be there seeing it while we were on a tour, and they were demonstrating their abilities and their feeling about getting that excitement from taking a risk and jumping off of something high into something low, and doing all of this while socializing. So at the ISGA conference and leadership retreat in 2011 in California, we started this discussion on the importance of risk. And basically from 2012 to early 2017, our group met several times to really hash out what was it that we wanted to put in our declaration, and what was it that we thought was important, and also represented global ideas. Through international consensus, we developed our declaration, and our group studied and discussed risk examples globally, global constraints, and differences and similarities in this generation of school grounds. So what I want to move into now is sort of the essence of our understandings of what we developed through those conversations, and then how that leads into the declaration, which Anders will go over. So one of the understandings that we came upon was that the standard playground has bigger accidents. It has less accidents, but it has bigger ones. So on the left is sort of some typical playgrounds that you can see around in the US. And on the right are some examples of a playground in Brazil and a playground in Germany. So if you have a playground where you've got graduated challenges, affordances for beneficial risk, then children can take those graduated challenges, and they might have more accidents, but they're smaller ones. And then they start to understand what they can each individually do and not do, and then they start to internalize their abilities, and they're not trying to do unrealistic challenges. So this was our first understanding. So with the collective understanding through the Alliance International Perspective, we also came to realize that we need to reorient kids' experience as a way of growing up with a sense of wonder, a sense of curiosity. This is so important to being excited about life. The image on the left is about pollination and food security. So the idea of introducing bees on school grounds can be very terrifying to some people because there are kids that are allergic, but there's ways to mitigate that. And this is often considered a large risk, but there are also benefits. So at Pollination, a nonprofit in the UK, they introduce bees, they introduce bug hotels, wildlife habitats, all types of beneficial insects. But before they do that, they hold a survey of what's happening on the site. In terms of habitat and in terms of the students' awareness of things, and then they do the same survey a year later. When they introduce bees onto a site, students are trained by professional beekeepers. So this type of project is considered risky. It also has opportunities for wonder as well as food security. So in Ms. Sandsetter's paper on risky play, she talks about, sort of the spectrum of kids and what how some kids need a little bit more help understanding what their abilities are with risk. So challenge can mean different things for different people. And this is an image of a special school in the UK where the challenge of jumping off a log is very high, and you can see it in this child's mind to his ability, as you can see by his expression and the children watching. This is a moment of achievement and of confidence building, and they've really built up to this moment in the images that Mary Jackson shared with me and explained to me the story of this to get to this point. And it's just really a confidence building moment. But the idea that there's different levels of appropriate challenge is something that is really key in understanding any school population. A fourth understanding is that adult intentions and interventions, both explicitly and implicitly demonstrated, create tone of space. They create the opportunities for the space. They can create the constraints of a place. We shape the space through codes, policies, rules, elements that are provided or not provided, and supervision. So many codes are focused on no significant injuries or death and are written to cover everyone in the country or region, but population can really vary. Place-by-place supervision is an effective way to look at how to provide for kids, just as in the last slide. And in the UK, their code is meant to be interpreted on a place-by-place basis, which gives supervisors the power to determine what would be good for their children, what would be best for their students. And this isn't something that is possible in terms of the US, but it's something that we can talk about in the Q&A a little bit more if you want. But supervision could be a very powerful way of providing opportunities for children. And Anders likes to say that, because he does a lot of this, that supervision is about just being with the children, knowing their abilities as individuals and as a group, and how to manage and provide opportunities for them. So the images on the left are the standard playground with arrows telling the kids which way to go, rules on that playground, and the image on the right is somebody from the ISGA who's just supervising and hanging out with the kids. And because she's there, they can have this fire and they can understand how to be around that dangerous element. So this is risk is not only good for play, but also can be considered for learning. And it's something that we talk about in our declaration. And this is an image from one of our leadership council members in Indonesia, where he was the principal of the school. And at the bottom of the slide, I've got the link to his presentation that he gave in Sweden, talking about this particular learning experience. So he likes to work with his classes, he says, so they can become a good class. And he likes to do that by providing them with tools and education to identify and solve problems through what he calls outbound. Outbound is learning by doing outdoor activities with steps. So Muhammad Arifuddin says the first step he likes to do is having the group stretch as a group. And he moves into fun games with the group to build teamwork and cooperation. The third step is he likes low impact risk cooperated activities. So if you go onto that link, you can see the kids are blindfolded and they're carrying around one of their friends, but they're doing this in a way that they know that they have to trust each other and they're taking a little bit of risk. And the image here is what he called the high impact risk of personal challenge. So he's really pushing them to the edge of their comfort zone to get them to take sort of what Bernard was showing, that risky moment. And then the last step he has is after they've all done this, is they go through a debriefing and reflecting together. He says by doing this, he gets really strong and he gets really resilient children. He says it's really essential to that form of learning. And there's other examples of this in the ISGA, but this one I thought was just a really interesting story and really shows that. So one of our other understandings is that there's no risk equals no challenge. Without risk, children are not challenged. They don't readily develop and they become bored. And in order to develop healthily, physically, mentally, socially, and emotionally, they really need risk. So a lot of these things listed under benefits or risk are really those pieces of development: risk assessment, self-efficacy, emotional intelligence, state of flow. These are all necessary for healthy development. And our colleague in Japan always reminds us that we want to have joy. Mariana Brusani discusses this in her presentation and in her research, and it's also evident in many other studies from Children in Nature Network and others, just about how health issues have really changed in this generation because our kids aren't as physically active as they used to be, and risk is part of helping encourage kids to do that. And this is the last understanding, and that is that a risk-free playground is neither possible nor desirable for children's development, just as I was talking about self-efficacy, joy, risk assessment. So rather than approaching a design, a site program, or supervision from the risk minimization perspective, we would like to ask, what are the benefits we want to provide children in addition to that? Do we want to place a space that affords social skill building, a physical skill development, empathy, state of flow? How can we develop our spaces to empower our children? So with that question, I'm going to turn it over to Anders, who recorded this so he's not up in the middle of the night, and he's going to go over the declaration with you, and then I'll take over again. So let's see if I can get this to work.
Hello, everybody. Sweden calling. I'm glad to be able to participate in this webinar. Due to the somewhat uncomfortable time difference, I regret that I'm not with you live, but hopefully it will work anyway through this recording. Well, Lisa has given you some important definitions. She's also given you the background to how we, in the International School Grounds Alliance, have seen the need for an international statement on the necessity to offer children beneficial risk-taking activities. I will now do my best to guide you through what became the result of our work in the Beneficial Risk Working Group. This result is based mainly on scientific evidence, but also partly on our own experiences and beliefs from different cultural contexts around the globe. Here it is, the Declaration on Risk in Play and Learning. In the introduction, we conclude that if a schoolyard is to be regarded as well-functioning, it must offer opportunities for risk-taking activities. In the long run, that means, of course, that it is the responsible adults and institutions that shall use common sense in providing and allowing risk-taking activities for children and young people. By using the phrase common sense, we want to emphasize the importance of the attitude of the responsible adult and point out that designing an environment based mainly on technical matrices and templates is not sufficient. We have also gathered a rather impressive amount of references from research in this area. The references come from many different countries around the world. And please do not try to read the titles here. I only wanted to show you in one slide how much research we actually found out there. The ISGA has also noted that the general trend is the same in many countries, that the strongest guiding factor in the design of children's environments is fear, rather than science-based knowledge. Fear of making mistakes, fear of the unknown, parents fear that a serious accident might happen to their children. So, in good intentions, you tend to protect your child too much. We can find expressions for this in many countries. You are probably familiar with helicopter parents and bubble-wrapped children. Another expression is that children are like greenhouse flowers, which means parents create well-protected conditions for their children to grow up in, where they don't have to struggle in, for example, hard weather and winds. In Sweden, we have the expression curling parents. The parents use the broom frequently to sweep the course clean from all obstacles so that the children can slide through their childhood without encountering any difficulties or challenges. Common to all cultures is that the adult behavior is done with the very best intentions, but with fear as the driving force. But research says that children and young people need challenges. They need to take risks to develop their cognitive, social, physical, and mental skills. It's important to point out here that all children, regardless of ability, have the right to develop these skills. We also find support for this approach in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So let me quote a section of the general comment on Article 31 of the Convention. It's about balancing risk and safety. It goes like this. Fears over the physical and human risk to which children are exposed within their local environments are leading in some parts of the world to increasing levels of monitoring and surveillance, with consequent constraints on their freedom to play and opportunities for recreation. While children must not be exposed to harm in the realization of their rights under Article 31, some degree of risk and challenge is integral to play and recreational activities and is a necessary component of the benefits of these activities. A balance is needed between, on the one hand, taking action to reduce unacceptable hazards in children's environment, such as closing local streets to traffic, improving street lighting, or creating safe boundaries for school playgrounds. And on the other hand, informing, equipping, and empowering children to take the necessary precautions to enhance their own safety. That was the UN Convention. Not only parents, but also other adults responsible for children's development act out of fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of being prosecuted, and therefore make decisions that do not take into account the balance that equips children to develop their own risk assessment capabilities. The ISGA believes, with the support of research, that such a balance gives children and young people important lessons about themselves and their world. These are lessons that cannot be taught and can only be learned through experience. Caution, resilience, courage, knowledge about one's own abilities and limitations, and the self-confidence to reach beyond them are learned through self-chosen action. The conclusion is simply that a policy that implies indiscriminate risk minimization can be more harmful than beneficial. This conclusion, as well as the claim that hurt can provide a positive experience, is certainly overwhelming to many people. But nevertheless, ISGA's main message in the final paragraph is that school grounds should not be as safe as possible, but as safe as necessary. Because the trend of an often unjustified and excessive fear of risk is spreading more and more, the International School Grounds Alliance want to make a call to action. In simple words, all adults have a responsibility to help reverse the trend, but we have specifically identified some main target groups. Educators is perhaps one of the most obvious. Parents and other adult family members is another. All those who plan, design, manage, supervise, and maintain school environments need to take benefits of risk into account. Administrators, policymakers, and, not forgetting, insurance companies should also devise policies that permit and encourage activities with beneficial levels of risk. Well, thank you very much for listening. I hope you think the declaration makes sense and can be a useful tool in your everyday work. Please help us spread the word. Maybe you have questions and comments to what you have heard, and for that reason, I give the word now back to Lisa again.
All right.
And what an eloquent statement in his second language. I'm pretty impressed.
Yeah. Sweden, people from Sweden can speak English better than I can sometimes. I just want to conclude. This is the last slide that I'm going to discuss, and then we'll have a slide in Q&A. I thought what Anders covered there was really key, especially as safe as necessary. But really, there's a website for International School Grounds. We have a page on the declaration that's at the link at the bottom of the screen. And what this declaration provides is a global summary of these ideas and the research on beneficial risk. As Anders said, it's based on the United Nations Convention, and it can be read and accessed and shared in over 20 languages. There's a few we're still working to get up there, but we've got it in many languages. It can also, I see some of the questions up here. One, and this is the beginning of an answer to one, is that this can be utilized as a resource for any adult that makes decisions that impact children's play on school grounds, locally, regionally, countrywide, or internationally. The resources at the back as well as the statement on the front, and that we've been asking people to endorse this statement so that we can start to collect an international collective voice on risk. Risk has been this sort of topic now since about 2010, 2011, and there's a lot of people out there. And by putting everybody kind of in one spot and saying, yes, this is what we agree upon, it gives us a little bit more power and push against large barriers like code writers and insurance companies and so forth. Right now, we've got about 183 endorsements from people and organizations from around the world, in addition to the Leadership Council endorsements, and some really great quotes that people have written when they've endorsed it that I can share with you in Q&A if we have time. So with that, let's turn it over to question and answers, and I'm going to leave this screen up. It's got the International School Grounds website information. It's got my contact information if you have questions for me. It's got Anders' contact information if you have questions for him. And then, as Tim mentioned at the beginning, it's got the survey link so you can talk about this particular webinar and give feedback to Green Teacher.
Great.
And with that, we'll go into questions.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and of course a shout out to Anders, who hopefully will be listening to the archive version to see how he sounded, and I'm going to say again, just to repeat how delighted I was that he put the kind of care he did into his tape presentation. We do have questions already, and I've scribbled down a few for you as well. But let's start with the very first question. I think that came fairly early on from Becca, and she was very moved by the slide you showed of the 3 generations and the distances they were typically able to travel freely on their own, and how that shrank over generations. And her question, I'm just kind of scrolling down to it. And by the way, while I'm scrolling to the question, those of you who joined us later, welcome, by the way, but do tell us where you're from in the chat box if you haven't already, and what involvement do you have in dealing with, if any, in dealing with risk in children's play areas. We'd love to know where you're from. Okay, so back to Becca's question, which I was just looking for, but it was basically, she was asking, is that largely, was that slide that you put up in showing the generational change, the shrinking area of play, what was the cause of that shrinking?
Well, so I personally don't know the cause of it. There's a lot of guesses as to what that cause is, and I see her question, and she's asking, is it related to urban development and reduction of wild spaces? And I think it depends on where you go from community to community. Is there concern for traffic? There's the kidnapper concern. There's all those types of things. But along with that, our office did some research on that because we were curious ourselves, and I feel like there should be some follow-up on it. But what we did is we took the US Census data and we broke it up by generations, and we looked at it at sort of like a 10-block household sort of average. And what we found out was, like, right after World War II, the baby boomer generation in the US there were a lot of stay-at-home parents. There was a lot of households that had more than 2 or 3 kids. In some instances, there were households where there was at least two adults that stayed home because maybe there was a grandmother living with them or an uncle or an aunt. And then as you move into the 60s and 70s, you start to see that there are more households that have a single parent and more people that are working. And by the time you get to where we are today, almost all of the parents are at work. And there's fewer kids within the 10 block household. So when I was a kid, I'd go out on the street in the late 60s and early 70s and see who was there after school. And so I think that is a big factor in that we sort of torn at the social fabric, that there's no eyes on the street. If we all just let our kids come home and everybody was off at work, there would be nobody there to kind of be there to give them a Band-Aid or do this or that for them. And I think with our working lives, we've structured our kids' lives. And by doing that, we need to think about how can we provide for our kids to either allow them to roam again and make safe ways for them to travel to urbanized spaces, and or provide them with the opportunities that we did have in these marginal spaces. So there's adventure playgrounds and different ways that you can provide for the way kids can explore within a confined space. But there's answers to that. And I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done on it. I hope that helps answer that question.
It's a great answer. Thank you very much. I want to take you up to Tanya's question. And it's really the broad question, the big one, which is how do we shift mindsets in the public sphere? She's talking about public school boards, but also in our communities that currently are very focused on safety and the fear of litigation. Any suggestions?
That's a great question. So I like to think of that as starting with the idea of as safe as necessary versus safe as possible. And I think there's a few different ways to tackle that. And sort of we're at this point in society where I'm hoping the pendulum's going to start swinging the other way in terms of our understanding of fear. But Bernard Spiegel has an image that he shows, and it's like a scale. And he does this beneficial risk assessments that he does in the UK. And I'd like to see more of that here as one sort of answer to that. And so he says, okay, let's put a tire swing in that tree. And you can put on the fear side of the scale, oh my God, here's all the things that I can see that are going to go wrong. And then on the beneficial side of the scale, you can weigh what the children get from it. And so it's looking at it from both ways. And I think there's a way that peer to peer, so teachers to teachers, parents to parents, that this discussion could start, and that would be sort of coming from the bottom up. But also we can sort of head things from the top down, and that is by endorsing this declaration and using the declaration, but also going back with the arguments of what is the, by making these spaces as safe as possible, where actually is a detriment to children's health. And we can push this through media as well as just pressure among ourselves. So on Sunday, there was a time, the front cover of the New York Times had an article on beneficial risk and how it's changing in Britain. That's the best answer I have right now. Other than that, I think the other thing to do when you have somebody that's fearful, I like to try to work with them and as a professional and find out, well, what is the fear and what's driving that and how can we mitigate it? And sort of how I was talking about the shallow end and the graduated challenges for kids, how can you start to add things to a place so that the adults get comfortable with it? And one way to do that is to start with small things and go big. And another one is to take those adults that are fearful to a place that's local where kids can do things. So when I went on my first tour of international school grounds, I went to Berlin in 2010, and I saw happy faces and I saw kids that were able to do all types of things. And I came back and I was so excited to sort of spread the gospel, and people just didn't believe me. So if there's a local place where you can take people to see that so they can actually believe that children are capable of doing these things, that is also helpful.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And there's a quick comment from Megan who says, she operates a lot on the forgiveness model rather than the permission model. And she has the data to back up, given that she's been working at this for a few years, and to show that injuries really are quite rare anyways. That's great. Do you, I would also, I guess my own quick answer too is that is to remind people that one way to help move the needle a bit is to encourage everyone to watch this webinar when we'll send out the link to the archive version of this of the recording that we're creating right now. We'll send that out to you tomorrow, and do share it. Anyone who can freely view this webinar for the next 30 days without being a subscriber to Green Teacher. And so do share the link far and wide and encourage, because I think the reason I say that is because, Lisa, the walkthrough you did in the early part of your presentation was just fantastic. Very compelling slides, compelling commentary. I mean, it's a very strong argument that you've made. And I think the more all of us can share that and your expertise, whether through this webinar or other means, is going to help move that needle along. There was another question. I think Tanya asked a second question, and you and Anders talked about the declaration, and she's saying, is the declaration the same as the position paper on risky play? And that may be Tanya, I may need you just to clarify. Participaction, Lisa, is a national program. It's been around for a couple of decades here in Canada. Doesn't get a lot of press the way it used to in the early days, but it's basically, as the name implies, a program that encourages all Canadians to be active, and not necessarily outdoors, but usually. And so I'm wondering if, Tanya, you're referring to a participation position paper called Risky Play. Maybe you can clarify that.
I think I can answer that.
Oh, go for it.
So Ken Collier from Evergreen presented that the participation position statement on active outdoor play from 2015, and I saw that, and I think that's what she's referring to. And our statement is different in that we created the statement with some of that in mind, but with many of our own international discussions. But on the research side, a lot of our research does come from that, because Evergreen did help us put together the research aspects on the back of our declaration.
Great. Okay. Well, that's good. I'm glad you're familiar with it. A good international understanding there. I think we have more questions, and I'm having trouble even just keeping up. And thank you for sharing that link, Lisa. Let's go back. There's another question from right above that. Sorry, I'm just not, here we go. From Becca. I don't know if you can see her. She says, to the point that, quote, all children have the right to play, comma, regardless of ability, unquote, how does the physical accessibility factor into design for risky spaces?
I think that's a great question. And I think, there's inclusive play, which is different than in the US. We say, physical accessibility, ADA accessibility. I know Canada's got a different code. I think it's the AODA. And that's, as a landscape architect, what we're required to follow. But with inclusive play, you can design things so that somebody of any ability can be participating in anything at any time. I don't know the name of a woman, but she did a presentation at Children Nature Network where she said, we want to empower kids with physical disabilities as well, while still making them comfortable. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. And one thing, when we think about physical disability, we think about kids in wheelchairs. And kids in wheelchairs are sitting in chairs that were designed for corridors. They've got 1-inch wheels. When I was on a tour at a schoolyard in Berlin, the landscape architect took us through, and he said he did community participation with the students prior to designing the space. It was a school that had a lot of children with disabilities, and they specifically wanted more challenge. And so he designed that schoolyard for challenge around them. And while we were there, we saw it in action, and their wheelchairs looked like mountain bikes. And these kids got off on the terrain. They went on they had these paths that were going up and down that were wheelchair accessible. Then they'd go off on the train and they'd combat crawl to different play elements. And so it was really answered a lot with that. But one thing that I want to just point out that Robin Moore talks about, and a lot of ISGA members talk about, that we tend to forget, is that play is not play equipment. Play equipment tends to be played on 10 to 30% of the time, and Robin has some behavioral mapping studies that he did on this. And in one of the examples of the German playground that I showed, Galilei Grundschule, they actually have this enormous yard. It's full of topography. It's full of bushes. It's full of all kinds of boulders and logs, but there's actually only 4 pieces of play equipment. The swing set that you see that's round, the wall the kids are climbing off of has that slide on it, and then there's 2 other small pieces of play equipment. So when you design with landscape like that and you're allowing for the freedom of space, you can really design for more inclusiveness as well as physical accessibility.
And that your answer already elicited another question, Lisa, which from Becca. And she's asking, what's the name of that school in Berlin that you just described? I don't know if you may not have that offhand, but if you...
Can I type on here? I don't see how I can type on here, and it's not private to you.
Yes, it goes to all panelists, but you can also give it to me later, and we'll send it out in the follow-up email as well.
Okay, I'd be happy to do that. Does anybody have other questions?
Well, I've got a whole bunch. So while we're waiting for more questions in the chat box, let me throw a couple at you. How can a school or a school district modify their supervision to provide for beneficial risk?
Well, there's a few different ways to do that. I touched on the UK and how their code actually looks at saying, here's sort of the play specifications you should design to, but allow the supervisors within the school to determine what is appropriate for that school population. So I think that there's a lot of ways that supervision can start to say, a school can start to say, what are we comfortable with? What is our parent population comfortable with? How can we inform people so that we can start to do a little bit of this? And with that is developing a play policy. And I really highly recommend that, because rather than just having knee-jerk reactions to codes and maintenance budgets, a lot of schools now are developing what is it they want to provide for and how do they get there. And I think that's sort of the best answer that I can come up with, except for a little bit on examples of Germany. And I talked about you learn to fall by falling, but they actually have 400 school grounds in Berlin. And they've worked with their students on ways to design the spaces and add to the spaces over time and ask the students what they feel comfortable with. And so just like graduated challenges, they've built up their yards over the past 15 or 20 years, I think it is now. And so starting with, maybe we throw a few boulders in that are low and kids can play on them, and there's a soft surface of mulch that they can fall on. And these boulders can be, learning boulders or character boulders, and you can, don't have to make it this big deal. And then you can sort of build from there and see where it goes. And that's one way to do it. And also is bringing in these play parts. I hope that's, that's my, sorry.
No, that's great. That was a good answer. We're looking, of course, at the slide that, as you mentioned earlier, has the internationalschoolgrounds.org/risk URL. At the School Grounds Alliance website, is it a place where people can go and find out about which countries, have much more progressive policies on this topic, and perhaps which schools are also practice, incorporate beneficial risk?
No, that's not on the website. That would be great to have on the website. So I think the most information that's been given on is actually this webinar with the listing of these countries where we got the information, the images from. So Berlin has a really great policies, and if people have the money, there's and ever want to see it, there's a man named Frode Spana from Norway who does tours of Berlin schoolyards every year. I could give Tim that information. The ISGA has conferences almost yearly. There's going to be one this November in Japan, and they've done a lot of work on beneficial risk. So it's opportunities to hear professionals speak as well as tour yards. And there's a new in the last couple of years, there's this movement or an organization that's come out called Anji Play, ANJI, and it stands for the Anji province in China. And it's a province that's sort of out in the country, and things developed before the internet. And the woman who oversaw this whole district decided to sort of just follow what the children wanted and developed a whole program. And you can go visit those places as well. They're not officially at leadership council members right now. Otherwise, I would have loved to have shown some of their images with their permission. But they've just got incredible stuff, and you can Google their work as well. But that gives you a starting point for where you can find some of these schools.
Fantastic. Well, we're also getting questions very much related to the Alliance. When's the next conference, and how can people add their support to the risk declaration?
So adding your support to the risk declaration, you can just go to the ISGA risk link, which is here on the screen now, and you just fill out the form, and then that'll add you to somebody who endorses it. And whether you're representing your organization or as an individual, you can do that. And then in terms of conferences, there's going to be a conference this November in Japan. There'll be another one next year in Scotland. And then after that, I'm not sure where they're going to be going. But last I checked, I wanted to sign up for the one in Japan. It wasn't online to register for yet, but that should be coming up soon.
Great.
Opportunity.
And let's give the last question here to Becca. You can see her, she just added hers. She's talking about leading day camp programs and tried to introduce risky play opportunities. She's really just getting started. And her question is, how can we introduce risky play to children who really haven't had much context or much experience in managing and determining what risk is reasonable and so forth?
Well, when you're adding risky play or any kind of element to a school ground or a program, one thing that I've learned is that the learning curve is super steep at the beginning. So my old business partner, Sharon Danks, as a parent, she added a pond to her children's public schoolyard in Berkeley, California. And it wasn't deep. It was designed so nobody would drown. But at the same time, for the first 2 weeks at recess, they had a parent volunteer, so they had extra hands on deck to be standing at the pond and to remind the kids about, what were the sort of safety rules so that people can start to understand how to manage this. And, you can't put your arm in all the way down to your elbow, different things like that. And so, develop a plan and think about that there's going to be a steep learning curve at the beginning, and then it gets easier. And if you can't get parent help or additional adult resources, think about what's something simple you can start with and what's the group that can manage it. And with any group, you're going to have some kids that can really assess risk, some kids that are really good physically, some kids that have good intellectual abilities, and you just got to start small and sort of go from there and get help. So another thing is that if there's any way to just show them images of stuff, they can kind of learn from that. I did a whole school workshop with kids at one school and then came back and worked with them. And it was interesting to see how the yard changed just based on the kids seeing ideas from the slideshow. And I think that's my best answer on that one.
It's a great answer. And I want to thank everybody for their participation this evening. I'm going to have to actually, I'll turn off the recording.